Kyle Kelly, thanks very much for joining my show. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, how are you?
Good, good. So walk me through, this is the easy question. Walk me through memory lane. You dabble in cybersecurity, programming, running your own company. Talk to me about how you started with the journey, maybe even starting the early days where you didn't even know what you were doing. And then let's go from there.
Yeah, so the way you phrased that, I mean, I still don't really know what I'm doing for the most part. But I think that's kind of just the cybersecurity space in a nutshell. I guess in the very early days, what got me into cybersecurity was really just, video games, being obsessive with them my entire life and playing a lot of MMORPGs, which pretty much consume your entire life. So you have to play countless hours per day. And as I got older, I had more and more friends that were playing more and more different types of games, and I wanted to be competitive at all of them. And so I had to learn how to kind of automate the busy work so that I could still be competitive at the MMOs and also play Call of Duty and all those other types of games that I could just quickly hop on. And so that led to bot development and kind of going into I don't want to call it the dark web, but the darker side of these games where there's gold selling and where people are sharing bot scripts and things like that, which ultimately just progressed into the real world. How can I break things? And I started working as a junior system administrator, junior network administrator, and kind of had that traditional path where I learned how things worked in an enterprise, and then just having kind of the cybersecurity brain was constantly looking to pick them apart and see where the holes were throughout that process.
If you don't mind, I would love to double click on the whole gaming thing. I got two kids, they're 11 and 14, and they love gaming, right? And I always feel as a father that is they should go out and play in the real world more. And there's a bit of a trade-off. They always tell me, we play with friends and so on, so it's not so bad. And I listen to you and I feel, wow, this is pretty amazing that it actually led to uncovering some sort of interest in how things work. Do you think that's unique to you, or a lot of people do end up finding their passion through some of these experiences, which are not in the physical world, but in the kind of the virtual world?
Yeah, I think so. That's something I hope to eventually be able to kind of maybe be an investor in, or maybe even just coach on the side. So it's I think a lot of people in the older generations, they played baseball as a kid. Now they want to be an umpire. When I'm older, I want to have an esports team. So, but I think it's definitely a generational thing. Nowadays, when I'm interviewing people for positions, it's actually one of the first questions I ask is just, what video games did you play growing up? Because it gives me a sense of what kind of person you are, what kind of motivates you or drives you. So if you say something like RuneScape, which is an MMORPG where you can literally spend 10 hours a day clicking on a tree to chop it down, I know that you're a grinder. You just like to you like to see the experience grow. And you don't mind sitting and clicking the same damn thing for 10 hours. Whereas if you play Call of Duty, you need fast-paced, active kind of competitiveness. Maybe you like to yell at your teammates type of vibe, which is a very different type of personality.
What if you play Farmer Simulation?
Can't help you there. Get a remote tractor.
It really is super interesting, and I haven't seen companies ask, in their qualifications, they don't say, okay, they should play MMORPG, or maybe there's something that should change. Do you find that games today are very different than what they used to, in terms of and we've seen this everywhere, not just in the gaming industry. If you look at movies from the 80s that are much slower pace, and the cuts are slower, and the whole theme is just more relaxed. And now the gaming almost you can just get into convulsions after watching the first couple of minutes. Talk to me about the and we digress here, and it's fine, about the kind of the progression from a gamer perspective where things are today.
Yeah, I think part of it is trying to get as much stimulus in as short of a period of time as possible, just to capture the younger brains. But I think a lot of the way that game development has, the direction they've gone is to tailor towards younger kids, where we've seen like Fortnite, for example, where they tried very hard to avoid the we're not killing people aspect. Like maybe we're shooting Nerf bullets at them instead of real bullets. There's no blood because they were trying to get even my generation, like our parents, I grew up with a lot of friends who weren't allowed to play Call of Duty until they were in maybe high school. Whereas nowadays, if you're a kid, you're probably allowed to play Call of Duty. I don't think parents are really questioning it at this point. And if they do question it, there's alternatives, which I think people like Epic, who created Fortnite, really captured and understood, so that they can tap the untapped market more or less.
And what about, and this brings to a good point that they were saying that on the average, by the time you hit 18, you've seen X numbers of gore and death, like online and not just online, but also in movies and so on. Do you think that has any effects on the psychic of the young generations, or is it just a sign of times?
I think it does, but it's almost a necessary evil in a way. I think they're gonna see it one way or another. I mean, I also really love war films, so I feel like the gore in those is a lot more graphic than in a video game. I think more so what I'd be concerned with is the community in the gaming world. Growing up playing Xbox Live, especially, I started playing on Xbox Live by the time I was 8 years old. And so playing with people that were typically at least twice or three times my age, hearing the things that they're saying, and even targeting me in some of those discussions, that piece can be really hard to deal with, and you have to have some tough skin, which I think is now like a meme these days. It's like, oh, well, you didn't grow up in the Xbox Live days, so now you take everything personal and you cry about it. But even I have two younger brothers, and I hear what they're saying on the video games, and I'm just like, a couple years ago, I had to sit them down and like, you might want to be careful what you're saying to these people, because you don't want to influence them to do something harmful, or you're literally bullying them, even though it's a video game. Like, it's still a real person's feelings that you're targeting. So that's the biggest piece that concerns me.
And there's a whole section of which you alluded to in the beginning of creating hacks, modifying games, and there's actually quite a bit of business there too. Talk to me about that. For people not familiar with this, talk to me about that aspect, because that kind of led you into hacking and into the nuts and bolts of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I would say I'm definitely an amateur when it comes to video game hacking or botting. But RuneScape was the biggest one for me, because like I said, you can literally spend 10 hours chopping down a tree. So if I can make an automated script that does that clicking for me while I go and play another game, I basically just duplicated myself. It's kind of like Harry Potter now. I could be in two places at once. And that allows me to continue to be really competitive at the game that I love. And that could take years for my character to develop and be competitive. So to automate that was a huge help. And then also, in the same sense, you can automate the money-making process. So similarly, in that game, you have to kill certain monsters and collect certain items to sell, which you can automate. And now you're super wealthy in a video game. And when you're young and you don't have a real job and real money, video game currency is what makes you feel good. And I actually had to go through a personal kind of struggle to figure out what drives me in the real world. And somebody eventually said, I think you just treat money in the real world as if it was a video game currency, and you're just trying to pile up as much cash as you possibly can. because I'm a bit obsessive about investing in finance. So.
Well, it's good. I mean, it's a good obsession to have, and it's again, I see some benefits from playing video games and understanding the essence of money and how to get it. And quick question again, to stay in the kind of the topic of video games. At some point in time, there was this whole movement around VR, virtual reality, but I haven't seen that taking off as much as the traditional gaming. I mean, we've seen, how many frames per second and very high-end video cards that cost thousands. But we haven't seen a lot of gamers adopt the virtual reality goggles and so on. Why do you think that is?
I'd say it depends on the game. So, for example, in simulated racing games, there's a competitive scene called iRacing, where they literally scan racetracks and import them into a video game where you can feel every pothole, every pebble on the street. And so in those types of games, VR headsets are seemingly doing relatively well. They're continued to grow in usage just because you can get kind of the 360 view. You can look around at the racetrack while you're actively driving, which is really nice. And historically, you would need like 3 monitors to do that. So now people can consolidate their rigs. In other spaces, I think the issue is just the latency. You mentioned the high-end graphics cards. There's also the high-end monitors. There's the making sure that you have a hard connection to your router or your modem. And yeah, it's a competitive scene. Every millisecond counts. And so until VR can be perfect, and also not until we need kind of game developers to start investing in it as well. So like Fortnite got really popular because they were offering $1 million grand prizes. It's hard not to attract people when you're throwing money around like that.
And do you feel that's still doable to be as a career, to be a professional gamer?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, I'm not an expert in this at all, but I did try to be a professional gamer at one point, and one of my younger brothers, I would say, played semi-professionally, so we would drive around to tournaments and whatnot. And so my understanding is that the organizations are really difficult to manage and oftentimes impossible to be profitable. However, for the players, it's pretty darn reasonable. I think the industry is kind of at a point where they have to prioritize the players to get any kind of viewership, because the players are super valuable. They can go out on their own and just live stream if they wanted to. They don't necessarily need to be a part of a competitive team and kind of sell their soul to an organization.
And do you find that there's the ability to democratizing the gaming development? There's like engines like Real Engine 6, where potentially anybody can go on and create games, even maybe like simple games. But so why don't we see more indie games? And there's a lot of these multi-billion dollar game developer companies. So, but we've seen democratization in everything else, like in no code and so on, so be able to build apps. Why do you think the gaming arena is not as popular, like just by people contributing to the space?
It's a good question. I would say, me growing up, I always kind of judged the people who played indie games, especially if they're strictly single player games. It's like if I can't compete against somebody and destroy them, I have no reason to play this game. But then I got addicted to Tetris. I was like, this is not a multiplayer game, and I don't know what I'm doing, but my high score needs to get better. So I think the indie scene is growing, honestly, or maybe I'm just getting older, and so maybe that's a sign. Maybe indie games just tailor to the more veteran gamers who can really appreciate the game more so than just the hyped marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize, but this is fascinating. I'd love to continue on. I would love to. So let's dabble into the kind of the cybersecurity space. You mentioned that you doing video games and understanding some of the kind of the back scene of what it takes to break them created a path for you to do more cybersecurity. So talk to me a bit about what you do today, and then let's dive into some of the areas like the supply chain, cybersecurity and so on. And why don't we start with that?
Yeah, sure thing. So that in the cyberspace right now, I do kind of many different things, but one of them, I'm an executive consultant at Banksec, where we offer cybersecurity consulting services to financial institutions, primarily in the United States. So penetration testing, incident response, general controls, stuff like that. And then in addition to that, I'm a security researcher at SemGrip, where I work on our software supply chain security products. And so primarily I'm reviewing CVEs or security advisories and writing SemGrip rules, which are basically patterns to identify the vulnerable usage of dependencies in our customers' code base. And then thirdly, I'm the founder of Crime Hacks, which right now is a weekly cybersecurity newsletter primarily focused on software supply chain security. And also I share a lot of my personal blogs and things like that through Crime Hacks.
So which one do you like the most? Like from if you could choose to do one thing.
Yeah, so my whole life I've been a generalist. I think I'll always be a generalist. But it's been really nice to kind of focus in on software supply chain security. I feel like it's an emerging topic. It's been around for at least 15 years, but it's still something that not many people really understand. And so even though I've only been focused on it for about a year and a half now, I feel like I can kind of relate to the more veteran folks, which, similar to a video game, the earlier you get into it, the more competitive you can kind of be in the space. And so I feel like I got in pretty darn early, and I like that I'm competing with some of the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's becoming front and center. It's amazing. And you're right, it's been around for 15 years. So let's peel the onion on the issue, on the problem. For the people that are not familiar, what are the underlying issues with the software supply chain specifically? And maybe talk to me about the issues. Why is it so prolific, and why is it so difficult to fix?
Yeah, so really, I guess focusing on more open source supply chain. The organizations, pretty much every organization that is writing code is using open source code or open source dependencies / packages, whatever you want to call them.
And Kyle, I'll just pause just a bit. It's just kind of and the reason they're using it is why? Why are they using so many open source?
Gotcha. Yeah, and so when writing code, you can write a very simple function. Maybe you want to find the greatest number in a list. Well, we've written that function a bajillion times, and somebody else has published it publicly in open source code for you to just quickly import into your own code and then call that function directly, as opposed to having to go out and write it entirely yourself. So it makes coding way more efficient, and if you're trying to be a profitable business, you need to be as efficient as possible. And so if you can just import a package and use it, as opposed to hiring a developer to spend the next 6 months creating it, that's pretty good efficiency.
And is it true that I think there's a song lyrics that said everything that was said had been written, something like that. So are we done writing code? Is there functions for everything already, or is it still continuous process?
I would say it's definitely continuous. What's really common now is if there's a tool that everybody likes, maybe there's an API for it. I need an API wrapper, and so a lot of the packages nowadays are getting more and more redundant, I would say. Like there's other alternatives that could get you close to what you need, but people want to be as efficient as possible. And so if there's maybe one less step that I'd have to take if I use this other package, well, great, I'll use that one. And then we also see, for example, Lodash is a popular package. There's so many wrappers on that package itself. So there's a Lodash merge function. So now there's also a merge wrapper. So instead of importing the whole Lodash package, you import just the merge function, which you can do anyway, but that's kind of the mess of this.
And kind of for people that are not familiar, what is a wrapper when you're talking about specifically around software?
Yeah, so if say there's a package that does exactly what you want, but you want to add something to it. You want to add a feature or flavor, some additional context to that package. Well, somebody can take the original package, add the new ingredients to it, and now you can import the wrapped version. So it's the wrapped version of the original dependency or project with the extra ingredients baked in.
And so, okay, coming back to what you described, so we, in the process of software development, we reuse code that others wrote. So one would say, well, I don't see a problem with that. It's just, just efficiencies. So what's the issue?
Yeah, well, seemingly, if you're importing open source code into your projects, there are bad people in the world. And like all good things, bad people like to abuse them. And so, at least based on my research, it seems to be heavily North Korea that's starting to leverage a software supply chain to target software developers and just organizations, enterprises. A lot of it is for information stealing, which is interesting. But since you're basically importing code and then executing it in your applications, they can embed malicious code, which you then execute. So,
and these software packages, for people that are not super familiar with the process, I mean, some of them have hundreds and not, thousands of lines of code. So it's not like it's really easy to review those and figure out where, if anything, was designed to be malicious. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, I would say that's correct. There are some organizations that are now trying to identify malicious packages. So Phylum, they're doing a great job. And then there's also Guard Dog, which is an open source tool. It leverages SemGrip quite a bit to help identify indicators that it's a malicious package through static analysis. So there's people that are hunting for these. It's just that there's so many, there's many millions of packages out there. And yeah, it's not really feasible to go through line by line and have an expert review each line.
And so who's responsible for making sure that they don't use malicious packages or malicious code? Is it the software developer houses? Is it the companies themselves? Is there anything we can do during the development process, maybe pre-development process, or should we just look at the finished product and say, okay, let's do some software testing to find out that it doesn't do, or it only does what it's supposed to do? So which are kind of the ways for us to circumvent this issue? Yeah,
well, I'd say that's still yet to be determined to some extent. This is still just, there's still many software development teams that aren't even thinking about this. And it's not just malicious dependencies, but also known vulnerable dependencies. And so, historically, an application is built, the dependencies stay the same throughout its lifespan. Maybe they get updated here and there as needed. But, a lot of those, since they're open source projects, they often get forgotten about by the maintainers or deprecated. And now there is no just quick, easy upgrade. But if it's maybe the company designed this application 10 years ago and they don't want to reinvest in it, they're not going to pay a developer to go in and replace that dependency and refactor all the code and put all that time in. And so then you're left with a open source package that's being used by your code that is no longer being maintained. And maybe that old maintainer's GitHub account is compromised, and now they can go in and embed malware into the open source package that you're using. So it's kind of a spread responsibility to hit on your question. I think developers, we need to get developers aware of this so that it's at least in their mind. I don't think we need to give them the liability because they have enough on their hands already. But just them being aware of it and being mindful will go a long way. We're starting to see some organizations have open source code policies where they're evaluating the dependency maintainers. Because like you said, you can't really evaluate every line of code, but maybe you can take a look at the package similar to a vendor risk assessment. You can say, does it have at least 2 maintainers? Is it using static code analysis? Is it actively maintained? Things like that.
I've also heard that sometimes even maintained code is vulnerable, meaning that somebody, the adversaries are specifically maintaining it to almost lure people in to use it, because using code that hasn't been maintained is a red flag, but maybe potentially something was maintained by somebody else, maybe creating some sort of backdoor. But it's a bit of a scary thought, since we're knowledge-based economy, and everything is software, really. You think about it, and we rely so much on software for everyday life, but yet it's just a black box. We don't know what's operating behind the scenes. And there's some critical infrastructure, so not just critical infrastructure, but even not be able to access your bank account, or shaving off a few dollars from a transaction, or having fraudulent transaction, or even massaging just some few numbers, from whatever the output is. It's a really big problem. I don't think people are aware of how big this problem is. There's almost, I don't think that you can get up in the morning and go through until noon without touching a line of code.
Yeah. And based on lines of code, not that you can really assign a dollar value to open source code, but Harvard tried to do that in a research project, and they estimated the demand is roughly $8.8 trillion for open source code. So we're talking about a many, many $trillion industry, which isn't really an industry because it's open source. And it's been used and abused by organizations, enterprises, for-profit businesses for decades now. But kind of without the support it needs to be secure, to be verifiable, things like that. And now enterprises are starting to, unfortunately, pay the price for not supporting it.
Yeah, it really is interesting. And so there are companies out there that you mentioned, Fyland, which I interviewed the CEO here. What are for us as defenders, the ability to kind of figure out methods to circumvent that? And maybe it's like boiling the ocean. We're not going to be able to do that all at once, but maybe start creating more secure code. What are the kind of the steps? Somebody's listening to this, and maybe they're software developing, or maybe they are responsible for code. What's your, coming from you, what's the kind of the best practice to go around it?
Yeah, I honestly, I think the biggest improvement that can be made is just, like I said, being mindful of it. It is so glaringly obvious when somebody is using a bad package. There's going to be incidents like the XC libsma.
So Kyle, what you mentioned is that first we have to admit we have a problem.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And so, but the reason for that is just that people are using such horribly bad packages. They go to ChatGPT, they say, hey, I want this function. ChatGPT says, okay, import this package. Well, okay, that package hasn't been touched in 10 years. Like, software development has changed a lot in the last 10 years. You probably shouldn't trust something that hasn't been touched in 10 years. That's just pretty obvious to me.
But ChatGPT does not tell you, does it? I mean, it does not tell you can you ask it to give you a review of that code, or the status of that code?
Not that I'm aware of. You can't ask it for like the reputation of the dependency, but that's the scary part, because it'll tell you what dependencies to use. And it's gotten better at this, but there used to be, I forget what we were calling them. I think it was like shadow dependencies or something. But basically, ChatGPT was telling you to install dependencies that didn't even exist. And so that was a potential attack vector for malicious actors to then go ahead and upload their own package with that same name that ChatGPT is constantly recommending to people to use.
Yeah, it's almost AI poisoning, meaning that if you create enough, because ChatGPT, grabs, essentially grabs the kind of source from somewhere. So if you are vigilant enough and you upload enough crap out there to all various different sources, potentially ChatGPT can recommend, as you mentioned, a bad package or a malicious package, not necessarily on purpose, just because that's what's out there.
Yep, and I think that's definitely something that attackers are going to be looking for and hoping to abuse, because the hardest piece, it's incredibly easy. Like, you could do it within seconds, if not minutes, to upload a malicious package. The hard part is getting people to download it and getting the target to download it. So that's why there's some concerns with SBOMs, which is software bill of materials, because if organizations start telling consumers what dependencies they're using in their projects, now malicious actors can maybe try to leverage typo squatting, where they just change one character of a package name, hope that maybe they see Microsoft developers are all using this package. Let's try to typo squat that package and just change the name slightly and hope a developer has a typo while installing it. And then they can target Microsoft.
It used to be similar to making lookalike domains, right? It's very similar, like the typo thing.
Yeah, except and like you can do domain takedowns, and you can maybe just go ahead and purchase all the domains that look like yours. Similar to the domain scenario, it's an absolute nightmare, the naming convention in open source software dependencies. Right now, the recommendation is to basically take ownership of all the names, similar to just buying all the domains, which is not a great solution by any means. But
And so, to be mindful, as you mentioned, is there any tools that you can utilize, or while you are looking at these dependencies and creating code? And I'm assuming it's a continuous process. I'm assuming, because software writing development is a continuous process. So you can't just do some checks at the beginning and maybe towards the end. It's something you continuously have to do. What else can we do to minimize the risk, at least from that perspective?
Yeah, so the continuous part actually, in my opinion, isn't as important. It is good, especially if you care a lot about malicious dependencies, because hopefully malicious dependencies are taken down in a reasonable time frame, so they would only be available at point in time. But the bigger issue industry-wide is the security debt. So all those applications that were developed 10 years ago, 5 years ago, etc., those dependencies are likely all have deprecated dependencies being used. They likely all have known vulnerabilities in their dependencies. And so that's a lot of work to have to maintain those applications. And it's kind of a question for the industry as a whole. Is it reasonable to maintain those? Do we need to shorten the lifespan of these applications? Do we need to be more vocal about end of support, end of life? And do we need to be more proactive about making applications end of life? But even today, a lot of the current tools that are being created are still using legacy software as dependencies and things like that. So it's a really tough question. It's almost a matter of is it worth it? Because we don't see supply chain attacks popping up every day, at least not through vulnerable dependencies. If you scan any given application, you'll likely find that it's using dependencies with maybe 1,000 or more vulnerabilities. But what is the likelihood of them being exploitable? Well, now we have tools like with SimGrip, we offer reachability analysis, so we can tell you if you're using the vulnerable function from that dependency and its relevant security advisories. And that narrows down false positives potentially it brings it down from like 1,000 to 2 vulnerabilities that are actually reachable.
And you specifically use the term security debt. Do you mind just expanding on what that means specifically, just so people are aware?
Yes, so thinking of tech debt, it's just basically security that maybe you knew about, maybe you didn't know about, but now you're uncovering, and now you have a long laundry list of things that you need to take care of for you to achieve a clean bill of health. Unfortunately, for most people, it's the latter, in the sense that it was never even a thought. They're like, hey, like, we're using these dependencies, it's great, it makes us so efficient, but we never really consider the security concerns. So now we have this new tool, and it's telling us we have 10,000 vulnerabilities. And our policies say we have to get rid of all critical vulnerabilities within 7 days. And our customers are starting to ask about it.
Yeah, and there are tools out there, for example, that does like fuzzing, where they test the different variables that the function can get and to see what comes out. And that's another way to test whether the function is doing what it's supposed to do. Are you a proponent of that particular solution, or is it something that just needs to be done on a case-by-case basis? Because it sounds like to me like a lot of work.
I like fuzzing. My concern with it is that it's runtime analysis. So basically, the code has to be fully built. It has to go through its whole build pipeline. It's got to be deployed, and then you're running fuzzing suites against the application. And it's only going to hit what the fuzzer is designed for. So maybe it tests all random integers, maybe it tests random strings, maybe it's a combination of two, but it's never going to hit 100% coverage of all possible entries. And so it's great it's something that I would definitely want baked into the process. So like Google is a great example of this. Google manages the open source vulnerability database, or osv.dev, and they have a bunch of different tools. One of them is the open source security fuzzer. And so that, in combination with looking at known vulnerabilities and looking at the maintainers, they have a long list of things that they look for, fuzzing being one of them. It's a great combination. It's probably the most time-consuming step in that process, though.
Yeah, and maybe potentially for maybe critical applications. It's something that needs to be like another step. And what can you do as a buyer of technologies, a buyer of software, because I don't know if there's any ratings. You can say, when I go out and buy some groceries, I can say, okay, this is certified organic, is a free range, this is whatever. I mean, but in software, I don't know if do you get like a SBOM, software bill of material, with your, certified humane, meaning that somebody have already checked all those? Because there is none, not that I know of, at least.
Yeah, that's kind of the direction we seem to be heading with the SBOMs. Unfortunately, I released a blog post, SBOM, the gateway drug to supply chain security, because I went to all these conferences, and they know I work in supply chain. They're like, oh, that's the SBOM thing, right? Like, no, but maybe, kind of, I guess. If it gets you interested in it, then yes. So a software consumer, I think, should be asking for SBOMs, but they need to understand what they're asking for. Similar to like a SOC 2 report. A lot of people request them. They check the box saying that they received it from the vendor. Not many people are actually going through it and questioning the vendor if there was any gotchas and things like that. What my concern is in the software industry is that people are receiving the SBOMs, seeing that there are vulnerabilities, but not understanding what they are, how are they reachable, are they unreachable, what the heck is reachable even mean, and so then they're asking the wrong questions or no.
Yeah, and Kyle, I want to expand on what you just said for these people, because it's really important. When you mention reachable and unreachable, sometimes vulnerability depends on, it is vulnerable, but because maybe it's not something that someone can, from the outside world in, access that function, the risk associated with it is not as profound. So, and so not all vulnerabilities are ranked the same. It really is context dependence. Meaning that, and that's what, in your opinion, is not done. Meaning that they get the SBOM and maybe the list of vulnerabilities, but they don't have the ability and the mechanism to understand or ask the right question, what does that mean, and then review in an intelligent manner that they can actually do something with it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair. And it's a lot of it seems to be policy driven. It's, our policy says that we can't have any critical vulnerabilities in our applications. Well, your SBOM says that you have 100 of them. And so the vendor can say, hey, none of these are reachable. We triaged all of them. That indicates that they're false positives or don't impact our application. And the consumer, because they're the customer, and the customer's always right, they can say, we don't care. It's our policy. We can't have any critical vulnerabilities in our application. So what do you do as the seller there? Do you go ahead and refactor all your code, replace those dependencies, or invest in updating them if the updates are available? Or do you try to get fancy and argue back with the customer? Do you what I'm trying to point towards is it's scarily difficult to be ethical in that sense, because you're telling a customer something that's very logical. It makes perfect sense from an engineering and risk perspective, but they're not grasping it because of policy, and that might entice you to go down a less ethical route. Maybe use a weaker supply chain tool because it'll report less vulnerabilities. Maybe you don't use a supply chain tool. There's still so many software vendors out there that are just not doing software composition analysis at all.
And so these policies, the reason why they're sometimes unreasonable is just due to the fact that I'm assuming that a lot of people that wrote these policies don't really understand, and it's evident in all kinds of different industries, right? Like a tire is good to up to a certain many miles per hour, and meaning that it's not, doesn't mean that it's 100% safe at 160 miles an hour, but it's safer or has the rating for it. It's the same for software vulnerability. You may have some vulnerabilities that you may live with it. It's at least it's there, and that if you're going to go fast, 160 miles an hour without software, maybe something will blow up, but it's not necessarily the case. So you have to live with it. Do you find that maybe the fix is not necessarily just only on the software side of creating the software, but also on the policy side, and making sure that the enterprise and the companies that are buying the software also understand what it is they're asking for?
Yeah, so one of my pain points with the software supply chain security sector as a whole is that we're reliant on vulnerability management solutions, platforms, tooling, and expertise, which if you look at legacy vulnerability management, which is what pretty much everybody does, so I probably shouldn't use the term legacy there, but they're used to dealing with CVEs. We bought this product, it has a known vulnerability, we have to remediate it within X days. That's a very common practice, totally makes sense, because you're paying for the application or the software. The vendor should give you a fixed version within a reasonable time frame. If they don't, then shame the vendor, and the price they have to pay is that they no longer have that customer. In the open source world, that doesn't work, because the open source maintainers often aren't being paid at all, and so they're just, if they're going to release a fixed version, it's because they want it to be a good maintainer. So really, it's such a big problem to just rely on legacy vulnerability management, because CVEs, for example, weren't designed for software supply chain security. If there's a package with a vulnerability and that package is used by 10 applications, is there one CVE or 11 CVEs? Because now there's 11 different products that are all impacted by the same vulnerability, but maybe there's only one CVE for it. And so if your policy says you only have to remediate CVEs, and you're using those 10 products that all use the known vulnerable dependency, but they don't have a CVE assigned to it, does that mean you have to remediate it? Or, like, if you want to be ethical, then yes, but if you want to play policy games, then maybe no.
And it's interesting because there's also, the whole patching mechanism. Companies do this patching on a regular basis. They also review these patching process as part of the security policy. Can we do that? Can we continuously patch the software, or maybe there's other ways like creating a wrapper around software that's not secure, something that will look at it and then maybe make sure it always behaves.
Yeah, and so that both of those solutions are out there, or at least trying to be out there. So, for example, Dependabot, which the Dependabot core was actually just made open source, so now other organizations can start to embed it into their applications or projects. But more or less what Dependabot does is enable the auto-update feature for dependencies. So you can say, hey, if there's newer versions, just update the package in our application. The issue is that there's breaking changes. So if there's a dependency that maybe it went through a complete overhaul, or maybe they deleted a function and you're using that in your code base, well, when you update it, your application is going to break as well. There's something called semantic versioning, which is a common best practice for developers to adhere to, which basically says if the new version is a breaking change or has a breaking change or not. Unfortunately, there have been multiple studies that showed that roughly 15 to 20% of those that say they don't introduce a breaking change actually do. So you can't fully trust that, but it is a helpful indicator. But then on the wrapping side, there are vendors out there who are now trying to basically, we call it vendoring the package, where they take a fork of the package, they maybe apply the fix themselves, or they delete the vulnerable piece of it, and then they distribute it to consumers. The issue with that is you now have to, those vendors trying to do that might now have thousands of packages they have to somehow maintain, which isn't super feasible, because like we talked about earlier, it's not reasonable for them to read and understand every line of code. And so a lot of times you need to trust the maintainers of the packages because they know it best, if they're available and actually actively maintaining it.
And so it sounds that there's no easy fix, meaning there's no like some thing we can do tomorrow and all of a sudden we're all secure. And the problem is here to stay. We can kind of, like always, I think risk and cybersecurity risk in general is something we always struggle with. And there's never 100% elimination of risk, despite what some vendors would say. But it is also true in software supply chain, where there's always going to be a risk associated with reusing code. What about no code, right? We were looking at this whole no code movement where you don't have to know how to code. You basically go onto a platform or use various different tools that do all the back end for you. Is that a better, more secure way to write software? Is that kind of the future where things are going?
I haven't really ever given that much thought. I would. Is it more secure? That's the piece that I'm harping on, because in a way I want to say it's less secure, because if it has a flaw, well, now everybody that's using that no code solution is.
Yeah, Kyle, it's like, it's like I always like to, when people say that, I always like to say like the banana example. There's one strain of bananas that basically everybody eats, and so if that one strain of banana gets sick, like there's a disease that's spread, then we're without bananas. I think that's the same goes here. You're right. There's if everybody used that no code and has a vulnerability, then everybody else is screwed at the same time. There's no diversity.
On the positive side, it's hopefully one fix. So there's that side of it. What I think has been interesting in the supply chain space is the idea that perhaps we don't need to rely on open source dependencies in the long term, with tools like Copilot and GPT, etc. Rather than importing open source code, maybe you ask the AI to generate the code that you need instead of importing a package. The concern there is that it might get repetitive, and that would basically be the equivalent of importing open source code. But then there's also like security features that can be baked into the AI. So I don't know. I think it's going to be an interesting world, 10 years from now. And software development is definitely going to be, it's going to look very, very different for sure.
And so to make this real, because up till now we talked in very like high level, any particular cases that were recent or semi-recent for things that happened and companies got breached because of vulnerabilities in code that they've imported that you know of?
Most of the incidents seem to be around the malicious dependencies, which is interesting because the market for malicious dependency solutions seems to be not that great. Everybody's really focused right now on
zero day, yeah,
and vulnerabilities, which ironically don't seem to be contributing to a lot of the recent incidents. But I think that's, again, really harping on the policy-driven market right now. And also we have like the White House executive order that's pushing for the SBOMs. And so people are trying to follow those trends and building the infrastructure plans internally to be able to adhere to those in the future. I don't know if that's the best route from a security perspective. It's better than nothing, I guess. And what I will say, my one good thing about SBOMs is that people historically just haven't had a clue what's going into their applications, whereas SBOMs will give them that insight. It'll make them more mindful about what dependencies are being used in their projects. And then as people start to scrutinize them, they'll care more and more about the security components of it.
Yeah, and it's a step in the right direction. And I still think that there's how many companies today still like, or when they purchase software, they ask for the SBOM, like the software bill of materials. Like you would say one out of what, do you, because it's not as common. I think it's gaining traction, but it's still not there. And then as you mentioned, once they get it, what do you do with it? They need somebody maybe like yourself to review it and make sense of it. We are running out of time, but this has been wonderful, and thank you very much for taking the time and discussing some of the some of the gaming aspect of it as well as the software supply chain security. Before we part ways, you mentioned the 5 to 10 years, and I always like to come out with some sort of positive because the sky is not falling, and even though this with cybersecurity, what are kind of the maybe positive components or things that you've seen that we kind of leave part ways in a good mood?
Well, some people might be left in a good mood. My prediction in the supply chain space is that right now we're trying to solve the big umbrella problem, the known vulnerabilities and the what the heck is used in our applications. So right now it's heavily pushed on to security engineering teams, product teams, software developers. And that's largely because of the security debt problem that I mentioned earlier. Once we have the security debt under control, then we can start looking for that continuous monitoring piece and continuous deployment piece that can make this a almost forgettable problem. And hopefully that's when we hand it off to GRC and say, hey, all those policies that you guys wanted to push on us 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we can actually adhere to them now. Please start to enforce them, and we can live happy together. But yeah, right now it's just a policy versus security nightmare because it's infeasible in some ways. And so I'm looking forward to 3 to 5 years that being a manageable problem.
Yeah, it's normal process. I think there's always like this policy catching up to things and vice versa. I always mentioned that, we had cars going up to 60, 70 miles an hour without seatbelts wasn't mandatory.
Okay, well, you brought it up. I've been arguing that we need to increase speed limits. Everybody thinks I'm crazy for saying this, but how have we not increased speed limits in decades when the car's technology has gotten so much better?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And there's also some statistics, I think, that show that there's no correlation between the increase of speed with the actual, casualties. But maybe it has something at, maybe there's some other things that are in play we don't know about. And who knows, maybe we're waiting to be self-driving cars because, for it before we increase that speed limit. But before we part ways, Kyle, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you to know more about software supply chain, maybe some consulting, to know more about your personal blog, and where can we sign up for it and reach it?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active. My friends call me a linked influencer. So that's where I share most of my rants. It's just Kyle Kelly. Feel free to connect. Otherwise, my email for Cram Hacks is kyle@cramhacks.com. Also, feel free to subscribe to the newsletter for free weekly content.
Kyle, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. And I can't wait to see where the industry is going, as well as you personally. I'll follow up, and maybe we'll do this maybe quarterly basis, and maybe discuss some innovation in the space. Because as you mentioned, this is just we're kind of the ground floor of where things are going. So a lot more to come. So for those who joined us today, thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. And until then, stay safe online as well as offline. Thanks very much, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.